The sound was what paralyzed me first. It wasn't a tear. It was a heavy, sickening crunch. My mother, Evelyn, was standing over the custom quartzite island in my kitchen, holding a pair of heavy carbon steel poultry shears. Between the blades was my United States passport, or at least what used to be my passport. She didn't just cut it in half, she meticulously and deliberately butchered it, severing the RFID chip, slicing through the biometric data page, and reducing the watermarked visa pages into jagged, unrecognizable blue and white strips. "You're not going anywhere, Victoria," she laughed. It wasn't a maniacal laugh. It was worse. It was the soft, relieved, condescending chuckle of a parent who genuinely believes they have just saved their foolish child from making a terrible mistake. When she opened her manicured fingers, displaying the 5-carat diamond tennis bracelet I had purchased for her 50th birthday, and let the shredded pieces of my federal identification flutter to the polished hardwood floor. My flight to Zurich, Switzerland was scheduled to board at JFK International Terminal 4 in exactly 3 hours and 20 minutes. For the past 7 years, my life had been a grueling, sleep-deprived marathon. I had built a proprietary cybersecurity architecture from a laptop in a studio apartment into an enterprise software firm currently valued at over $50 million. But alongside that immense success came the invisible, suffocating tax of my family. My parents, Evelyn and Arthur, didn't view my company as my achievement. They viewed it as their personal, inexhaustible treasury. They lived in a sprawling, 6,000-square-foot colonial in Connecticut that my corporate entity leased for them. They drove imported luxury SUVs registered to my commercial fleet. Their premium, zero-deductible health care, their country club dues, their Michelin-starred dinners. Every single cent was funneled through administrative consulting fees, legally tethered to my primary domestic LLC. They loved my success. They paraded it at dinner parties. But what they truly loved was the leverage. They loved knowing that because I handled all the finances to keep them comfortable, they ultimately held the psychological reins. Until yesterday. Yesterday morning, a Swiss banking syndicate had officially approved the full acquisition of my firm. The buyout was staggering, a $45 million cash exit completely severing my ties to the startup. But European corporate acquisitions, especially those involving proprietary cybersecurity tech, are ruthlessly rigid regarding international fraud statutes. The contract had an absolute non-negotiable escrow stipulation. The funds would only be released upon my physical, wet ink signature, witnessed by a senior magistrate inside their Zurich headquarters by 8 a.m. on Monday morning. If I wasn't sitting in that leather chair when the clock struck 8, the exclusivity window shattered, the escrow dissolved, and the Swiss board would legally pivot to acquire my primary competitor. If I signed that paper, my domestic LLC would be formally liquidated. The corporate cards would go dark. The fleet leases would terminate. My new wealth would be locked inside a fortified, impenetrable European holding trust governed by Swiss privacy laws, entirely out of my parents' reach. They had figured it out. I still don't know if my father had bribed one of my junior accountants or if he had simply snooped through the printed term sheets in my home office during their surprise visit this weekend. But they knew the money was about to cross an ocean, and they knew they couldn't follow it. So they decided to physically amputate my ability to travel. My father, Arthur, was leaning against the heavy mahogany front door of my penthouse, effectively barricading the only exit. He was holding a crystal tumbler filled with my $800 Macallan Scotch, looking entirely too calm for a man who had just orchestrated a federal crime. "You should have brought this to the family board, Victoria," my father said, his voice dripping with that authoritative, boardroom baritone he used to make me feel small. "You know you aren't equipped to negotiate with European syndicates. They're sharks. They were going to rob you blind and leave you with terrible tax liabilities." I stared at the shredded blue paper on the floor. I could feel the adrenaline beginning to spike in my bloodstream, a cold rush of sheer disbelief. "The embassy is closed, sweetheart," my mother added, walking around the kitchen island, her heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. She poured herself a glass of San Pellegrino. "Even if you call the emergency line, a high-priority replacement passport takes at least 72 hours. The Swiss deal is dead." She took a slow, victorious sip of her water. The absolute arrogance in her eyes was suffocating. They thought I was a cornered animal. "So, here is what is going to happen," my father dictated, taking a step away from the door and pointing a finger at me. "You are going to unpack your suitcase. You are going to call your legal team and tell them you pulled out of the Zurich deal due to irreconcilable terms. And on Monday morning, we are going to restructure your domestic LLC. I will be stepping in as acting CFO with a 51% voting share, just to make sure you are protected from these reckless impulses in the future." It was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It was the ultimate, inescapable power play. You cannot board an international flight without a passport. You cannot pass TSA. You cannot cross borders. Without that little blue book, my $45 million exit was entirely physically impossible. They stood there in my living room, watching my face, waiting for the inevitable collapse. They were waiting for the tears. They were waiting for me to drop to my knees, to panic, to frantically dial my attorneys, to beg them for a solution, or to finally surrender and agree to their parasitic restructuring. That's when I looked down at the mutilated United States passport on the floor, and a profound, terrifying silence washed over my mind. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't scramble for my phone. I just smiled, turned my back on both of them, and walked slowly toward my leather carry-on bag resting on the velvet sofa. Because my parents had spent 30 years controlling every single financial and emotional aspect of my life, but they had been far too narcissistic to ever pay attention to the tedious, bureaucratic details of my grandfather's immigration history. My grandmother on my mother's side had crossed the Atlantic from Palermo in 1962. To my mother, Evelyn, the woman was nothing more than an embarrassing relic of a working-class past, someone whose heavy accent and calloused hands didn't fit the country club aesthetic my parents had spent their adult lives trying to project. When my grandmother passed, Evelyn only cared about liquidating her vintage jewelry, but I had cared about the paperwork. The brass zipper of my Tom Ford leather carry-on bag sounded impossibly loud in the dead silence of the penthouse living room. Evelyn watched me from across the quartzite island. Her condescending smile faltered just a fraction of an inch. The absolute certainty in her posture began to fracture as she realized I wasn't reaching for a tissue to cry into, nor was I reaching for my phone to call my lawyers in a panic. "What are you doing, Victoria?" Evelyn asked. Her voice was tighter now, the smooth maternal superiority entirely gone. "I already told you the consulate is closed. There is no emergency bypass for a destroyed passport. You're grounded. It's over." "I know the U.S. consulate is closed, Mom," I said smoothly, my back still turned to them. "And I know a federal replacement takes 72 hours. I wrote the risk assessment algorithms that flag international travel delays for my company's logistics software. You really think I wouldn't run a vulnerability check on my own itinerary?" I slid my hand into the concealed, RFID blocking interior pocket of the leather bag. "What is she talking about, Arthur?" Evelyn snapped, looking at my father. Now the panic was finally bleeding into her tone. Arthur pushed himself off the mahogany doorframe. He set his crystal tumbler of scotch down on the console table with a sharp, heavy clink. The ice rattled. The smug boardroom executive persona was evaporating, replaced by the instinctual aggression of a man who suddenly realizes the game board has been flipped. "Victoria, stop playing games and look at me," Arthur commanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, authoritarian bark. I am stepping in as acting CFO of your LLC on Monday. That is not a negotiation. You are not leaving this apartment." I turned around slowly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I just held up my right hand. Between my index and middle finger was a pristine, burgundy-colored booklet, and the morning light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows caught the gold foil stamped into the textured cover. It illuminated the intricate crest of the European Union, and directly beneath it, the bold, undeniable topography, Repubblica Italiana. Evelyn stopped breathing. Her hand, resting on the kitchen island, began to visibly tremble. Arthur's eyes locked onto the burgundy book, his pupils dilating in sheer, unadulterated shock. "What is that?" Arthur demanded, taking a half-step forward. "Is that a fake? Because if you try to cross an international border with a forged document, Victoria, you will be detained by Customs and Border Protection. You'll go to federal prison. The Swiss deal will be dead anyway." I looked at him with a level of cold, clinical detachment that I usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. "It's not a forgery, Dad," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings. "It's a biometric, globally recognized passport, issued directly by the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It took me 3 years of navigating foreign bureaucracy, translating birth certificates, and quietly passing consular interviews under jure sanguinis, the right of blood. It turns out, Grandma left me a lot more than just that jewelry you pawned to pay for your golf memberships." The silence in the room was absolute. It was the sound of a multi-million-dollar parasitic lifestyle violently collapsing. They had banked their entire financial future, their luxury cars, their sprawling estate, and their absolute control over my life on a single desperate act of vandalism. But you cannot trap someone when you don't even know what borders they have the legal right to cross. "Why?" Evelyn whispered, her voice hollow, her eyes fixed on the Italian crest. "Why would you do that without telling us?" "Because international tax law for a European tech acquisition heavily favors dual citizens," I explained, delivering the procedural facts like a coroner reading an autopsy report. The Swiss syndicate required an EU-based entity for the holding trust to bypass a massive capital gains tariff. Becoming a recognized European citizen expedited the compliance. It wasn't a secret to hurt you, Mom. It was a $45 million corporate strategy that you were simply too ignorant to comprehend. I unbuttoned my tailored blazer, slid the burgundy passport into my interior breast pocket, and picked up my carry-on bag by its leather handles. The power dynamic in the room didn't just shift. It shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. I walked toward the front door. Arthur quickly moved back in front of the mahogany frame, widening his stance, physically barricading the exit. His face flushed a dark, dangerous shade of crimson. The realization that the $45 million deal was actively walking out of his grip pushed him to the absolute edge of reason. "You are not leaving," Arthur growled, his chest heaving, his hands balling into fists. "I am your father. I built you. I supported you. You are going to sit down and we are going to fix this." He reached out, his thick hand wrapping violently around the leather strap of my bag, trying to yank it out of my grip. That was his final, fatal mistake. And I didn't pull the bag away. I let it drop to the floor. I stepped directly into his personal space, looking up into his eyes, and I didn't see a parent anymore. I saw a hostile liability. "Let me explain exactly what is going to happen in the next 60 seconds, Arthur," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet, surgical whisper. "If you do not move out of my way, I am going to press the emergency SOS bypass on my smartwatch. The police precinct is 3 blocks away. They will arrive in under 4 minutes." Arthur's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. "You wouldn't dare arrest your own father." "I won't have to," I replied, staring completely through him. "The state will. because when they walk into this penthouse, I am going to point to the shredded federal document on my kitchen floor. Defacing a United States passport is a felony violation of 18 U.S. Code Section 1543. It carries a maximum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face. The boardroom arrogance was instantly replaced by the paralyzing, cold terror of legal reality. And while they are handcuffing you and Mom for federal destruction of property, I continued, my tone completely merciless, I will inform the officers that you physically barricaded my exit. That is unlawful restraint and false imprisonment. You won't be restructuring my company on Monday, Dad. You will be sitting in a holding cell, begging a public defender to negotiate your bail. Arthur's hand slowly, mechanically released the strap of my bag. He looked at Evelyn, searching for a strategy, a lie, on a manipulative loophole to regain the upper hand. But Evelyn was just staring blankly at the shredded blue confetti on the floor, realizing her masterpiece of sabotage had just signed their death warrant. Arthur stepped aside. He pressed his back against the wall, defeated, entirely stripped of his power. I didn't run out of the apartment. I picked up my bag, opened the heavy mahogany door, and walked out into the hallway, leaving them standing in the absolute ruins of their own arrogance. Because I had a transatlantic flight to catch and a very specific set of financial umbilical cords to cut. The transition from the suffocating, hostile atmosphere of my penthouse to the sterile, hyper-efficient ecosystem of JFK International Airport felt like stepping out of a burning building and into a clean room. And I didn't look back as my black executive car merged onto the Van Wyck Expressway. My phone, resting on the leather seat next to me, remained dark and silent. Arthur and Evelyn weren't calling. They were likely still standing in my kitchen, staring at the mutilated remnants of my American passport, desperately trying to calculate how a 30-year campaign of psychological dominance had unraveled in less than 60 seconds. Terminal 4 was a symphony of procedural indifference, and I craved it. I bypassed the standard security lines and walked directly to the Priority International desk. The Delta agent behind the counter didn't care about the emotional terrorism unfolding in my apartment. She didn't care about Arthur's empty threats or Evelyn's shattered ego. She only cared about the logistics. I slid the burgundy Repubblica Italiana passport across the polished marble counter. The agent opened it, swiped the biometric data page through the optical reader, and waited for the machine to chime. The green light flared. The system registered a fully authorized, globally recognized European Union citizen. She printed my boarding pass, handed it back with a polite nod, and within 20 minutes I was sitting in the quiet isolation of the first-class lounge, watching a Boeing 777 being prepped on the tarmac. 14 hours later, the crisp, razor-sharp air of Zurich hit my lungs. There was no jet lag. Adrenaline and absolute clarity had entirely sterilized my exhaustion. By 7:45 a.m. local time, I was walking through the imposing geometric glass and steel lobby of the Swiss banking syndicate's headquarters on the Parade Platz. The boardroom was a fortress of competence. It was a massive, soundproof chamber overlooking Lake Zurich, anchored by a 20-foot polished oak table. Waiting for me were 6 executives and 3 senior magistrates, all dressed in immaculate, bespoke suits, operating with the cold, frictionless efficiency that the Swiss financial sector was famous for. There were no emotional outbursts here, no gaslighting, just mathematics, contract law, and the transfer of generational wealth. Henrik, the lead partner and chief magistrate for the acquisition, stood up and gestured to the leather chair opposite him. He didn't waste time with small talk. He slid a massive, heavy-bound leather folio across the table. "Good morning, Ms. Davis," Henrik said, his voice a low, even baritone that commanded absolute respect, the exact kind of respect my father always faked but never actually earned. The $45 million capital transfer is currently held in an irrevocable escrow shell. Pending your physical signature and my biometric notarization, the acquisition is complete. Your domestic LLC will be formally absorbed, and the funds will instantly sweep into your private encrypted holding trust, governed entirely by Swiss jurisdiction. He unscrewed the cap of a heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen and placed it meticulously on top of the document. "Do you have any final amendments?" Henrik asked. I looked down at the contract. The ink on the page represented 6 years of missed holidays, 80-hour work weeks, stress-induced migraines, and the constant, suffocating weight of funding my parents' parasitic luxury. "None," I said softly. I picked up the pen. The nib scratched smoothly against the thick, watermarked paper. I signed my full legal name, effectively executing the most lucrative, airtight corporate exit in my sector's history. Henrik applied his magistrate's seal, closed the folio with a heavy, satisfying thud, and tapped a command into his secure tablet. A massive digital monitor on the far wall refreshed. A green cryptographic loading bar filled the screen, followed by a 9-figure string of routing numbers, and finally, a confirmation receipt. The wire had cleared. The $45 million was liquid, offshore, and permanently shielded from the United States probate courts, civil litigation, and most importantly, my parents. I didn't celebrate with the executives. I declined the offer for a champagne breakfast. I simply shook Henrik's hand, walked out of the fortress, and took a private car directly to my suite at the Bauer au Lac Hotel. I locked the heavy oak door behind me, threw my coat on the velvet armchair, and opened my laptop on the mahogany desk. It was time to execute the procedure I had been dreaming of for half a decade. My parents had undoubtedly spent the last 14 hours convincing themselves that my departure was a bluff. In their deeply narcissistic minds, they likely believed I had gone to a local hotel in New York to cry, and that by Monday morning I would return to the penthouse, defeated, ready to sign over the controlling shares of my company to my father. I opened my encrypted corporate banking portal. When I bypassed the main ledger and clicked directly into the subdirectory labeled Authorized User Liability Accounts, the interface loaded, displaying the 3 active Platinum corporate credit cards tethered to my primary commercial line of credit. Card 1, Evelyn Davis. Current billing cycle balance, $14,200, mostly spent at luxury day spas, cosmetic dermatologists, and high-end boutiques. Card 2, Arthur Davis. Current billing cycle balance, $22,450. Country club initiation installments, imported cigars, and a custom tailor in Manhattan. Card 3, Davis Household Management. Current billing cycle balance, $8,900. I didn't lower their spending limits. I didn't place a temporary security freeze on the accounts to teach them a lesson or force an apology. I wasn't interested in parenting my parents. I was interested in amputation. And I checked the master authorization box selecting all 3 accounts. I moved my cursor to the red administrative button in the top right corner. I clicked Revoke Access and Terminate Lines of Credit. A 2-factor authentication prompt appeared, warning me that this action was permanent and would instantly decline any pending or future authorizations. I typed in the 6-digit code from my authenticator app and hit Confirm. The screen flashed green. Accounts terminated, cards deactivated. The digital umbilical cord was permanently severed. Next, I opened my company's executive health insurance portal. For 4 years, I had paid the exorbitant $3,000 monthly premiums for a top-tier Platinum PPO plan that covered Arthur's boutique concierge doctor and Evelyn's exclusive wellness retreats. And I navigated to the Dependents and Beneficiaries tab, selected both of their names, and initiated an immediate mid-cycle cancellation of coverage. The system processed the request instantly, generating a digital certificate of termination. I leaned back in the plush hotel chair, listening to the quiet ticking of the antique clock on the wall. I had just dismantled their entire socioeconomic identity with 4 clicks of a trackpad. That's when my cell phone vibrated violently against the desk. It wasn't a phone call. It was a push notification from the primary corporate banking app. It was an automated real-time fraud alert regarding a transaction attempted in Greenwich, Connecticut. Because my parents were currently sitting in a Michelin-starred restaurant attempting to pay for a celebratory Sunday lunch, I completely unaware that the floor of their financial universe had just vanished beneath their feet. The push notification glowing on my iPhone wasn't just a digital receipt, it was a perfectly rendered autopsy of my parents' social standing. Transaction declined. $842.50 at L'Auberge de Greenwich. Reason code 04, account closed, card confiscated. They had gone to the most exclusive, pretentious French restaurant in Fairfield County to celebrate their supposed victory. They were sitting at a white tablecloth booth, drinking imported vintage champagne, entirely convinced they had successfully sabotaged my $45 million exit. 2 minutes later, the screen shifted. The notification vanished, replaced by an incoming call. The caller ID flashed, Evelyn, cell. I didn't answer it immediately. I let it ring. Then I walked over to the Nespresso machine on the marble wet bar, selected a dark roast capsule, and listened to the rhythmic, frantic buzzing of the device against the mahogany desk. I wanted the psychological weight of the silence to press down on her. I wanted the maitre d' to take another step closer to their table before I finally picked up the phone and swiped the green icon. "Victoria!" Evelyn hissed through the speaker. She was whispering, desperately compressing her vocal cords to keep the wealthy patrons at the adjacent tables from hearing the panic in her voice. Over the line, I could hear the faint, elegant clinking of crystal stemware and the soft murmur of a jazz pianist playing in the background. "Call your wealth management liaison immediately," Evelyn ordered, her tone a fragile mix of maternal authority and creeping terror. We just tried to pay the check, and the waiter handed me back the platinum card in front of the entire dining room. He said the POS machine flagged it and physically confiscated the plastic. Call the bank and clear the fraud alert. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my espresso, looking out the floor-to-ceiling window at the snow-capped peaks of the Swiss Alps. "It wasn't flagged for fraud, Mom," I said, my voice operating at an absolute clinical flatline. "It was terminated." Evelyn let out an impatient, condescending sigh, completely refusing to process the reality of the data. "Stop throwing a tantrum because you missed your flight," she snapped, the whisper turning sharper, venomous. "You are embarrassing us. The sommelier is staring at your father. We do not have another way to cover an $800 tab. I turn the card back on. Let us pay, and we will discuss the board restructuring of your LLC when we get back to the house." She still thought she was holding the leash. She still pictured me sitting on the velvet sofa in my penthouse, defeated, staring at the mutilated strips of my blue passport on the floor. "I didn't miss my flight," I replied smoothly. The line went dead quiet. The ambient noise of the Greenwich restaurant seemed to amplify in the silence, the clattering of a silver tray, a distant laugh. "What are you talking about?" Evelyn asked. The arrogance vanished instantly, replaced by a hollow, breathless dread. "Your father watched you. The passport is on the floor. You're in the apartment." "You destroyed my American passport," I corrected her, delivering the procedural facts with surgical precision. "Now, you forgot that Grandma Elena was born in Palermo. I've held dual citizenship and a biometric Italian passport for 3 years. I used it to walk through the Priority International Terminal at JFK yesterday morning." I heard a sharp, ragged intake of breath. It was the physical, visceral sound of a woman realizing the floor of her universe had just dropped out from underneath her. There was a sudden rustling of fabric over the receiver, a muffled curse, and then the heavy, booming voice of my father hijacked the line. He had snatched the phone right out of her hand, abandoning any attempt to preserve his country club dignity. "Victoria, where the hell are you?" Arthur demanded, his voice thick with a sudden, violent panic. "I'm in Zurich, Arthur," I said, intentionally stripping him of his paternal title. "When I was sitting in the Paradeplatz headquarters 2 hours ago, I signed the acquisition papers. Henrik stamped the magistrate's seal. The firm is sold. The assets are fully liquidated. The $45 million is currently sitting in an encrypted Swiss holding trust that you have zero legal, physical, or administrative access to. I am completely, financially emancipated from you." "You cannot do this," Arthur practically roared, his boardroom executive persona completely collapsing into the pathetic, desperate shouting of a cornered thief. "We are your parents. We built your image. You turn those corporate accounts back on right this second, or I swear to God, Victoria—" "Or what?" I cut him off. I didn't yell. I dropped my voice into a register of pure, absolute ice that froze him mid-sentence. "Or what, Arthur? You'll ground me? You'll lock me in my room? You stood in front of my door and tried to physically trap me in the country, to stage a hostile takeover of my life's work. You committed a federal felony to hold my company hostage. You don't have leverage anymore. You don't have my money. And as of 20 minutes ago, I logged into the corporate portal and canceled your Platinum PPO health insurance." "Victoria, please!" Evelyn cried out in the background, genuinely sobbing now, the reality of the situation finally crushing her ego into dust. "Arthur, the manager is walking over here with security. What do we do?" "Then you better hope they're hiring dishwashers in the back," I said. I hung up the phone. I didn't block their numbers. I wanted the digital record of their panic. I wanted the voicemails they were about to leave, just in case they tried to spin a false, victimized narrative to our extended family later. I placed the phone face down on the mahogany desk. I took a deep breath, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of the last 30 years finally detach from my spine. But I wasn't done cleaning house, because Arthur and Evelyn didn't just lose their platinum credit cards, their Michelin-starred lunches, and their concierge doctors today. They were about to realize exactly whose name was actually on the deed to the sprawling 6,000-square-foot luxury estate they were currently calling home. The iPhone lying face down on the bar-o-lac mahogany desk didn't stop vibrating. It buzzed with the frantic, rhythmic desperation of a dying insect. I didn't answer it. I let the battery drain while I opened a new tab on my encrypted laptop, logging into the administrative portal of my secondary domestic holding company, Aegis Property Group, LLC. 4 years ago, when my tech firm hit its first major valuation, my father had demanded a new house. He didn't ask, he dictated. He found a 6,000-square-foot neoclassical colonial estate in a gated Connecticut community, complete with a temperature-controlled wine cellar and a 3-car garage. Arthur had insisted, with his usual boardroom arrogance, that the deed be placed in his name for tax optimization and optical leverage at his country club. I had nodded, paid the closing costs, and handed him the keys. But I never put his name on the deed. I had nested the property's title deep inside Aegis Property Group, a subsidiary shell completely controlled by my primary corporate entity. And I allowed Arthur and Evelyn to live there on a $0 month-to-month administrative lease, paying the property taxes and HOA fees out of my corporate operating budget. They had spent 4 years hosting lavish dinner parties, bragging to their wealthy friends about their real estate acumen, entirely oblivious to the fact that they were legally nothing more than glorified squatters. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, Aegis Property Group had been formally absorbed by the Swiss banking syndicate. I opened my email client and drafted a new message to Arthur's personal iCloud account. I didn't write a long, emotional paragraph. I didn't demand an apology for the destroyed passport. I simply attached a single unredacted 60-page PDF, the Master Commercial Transfer Agreement. I typed a single sentence in the subject line. Check the attached addendum, then checked the Connecticut state eviction statutes. I clicked send. Exactly 3 minutes later, the hotel room phone, the secure landline concierge phone resting on my nightstand, began to ring. They had figured out how to bypass my cell. I picked up the heavy receiver, walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the pristine, glittering waters of Lake Zurich, and answered, "Victoria, what the hell is this document?" Arthur's voice was completely unrecognizable. The booming, authoritative baritone was gone, replaced by the breathless, high-pitched wheeze of a man who was physically suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. He sounded like he was standing in a parking lot, the ambient noise of a busy road rushing past the receiver. "You transferred the Colonial to a European holding trust? Why?" "I didn't transfer it, Arthur," I said, my voice operating with the cold, frictionless efficiency of the Swiss magistrates I had just met with. "The acquiring syndicate purchased all domestic assets tethered to my primary LLC. That includes Aegis Property Group. That includes the house." "But we live here!" Evelyn shrieked in the background. She was no longer crying. She was in a state of absolute hysterical shock. "All of our custom furniture is in that house. My clothes, Arthur's office. You cannot legally do this." "I didn't do anything," I replied cleanly, taking a slow sip of my espresso. "But the new Swiss board of directors, the exact same board you tried to hostilely restructure this morning, has officially audited the company's real estate portfolio. They categorized your residence as a redundant, non-revenue generating liability. The property is scheduled for liquidation. It goes on the commercial market on Wednesday." "Victoria, please," Arthur pleaded, his voice cracking into a desperate hollow whine. The illusion of his power was completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a parasitic shell. "We are your blood. We don't have any liquid savings. You know that. We spent everything maintaining our image to support your business." "You spent my money maintaining an image for yourselves," I corrected him, the absolute icy finality in my tone, cutting through his manipulation like a scalpel. "You took a pair of shears to my federal passport to physically trap me. You committed a felony to hold my life's work hostage. And you do not get to play the victim when the hostage finally cuts the rope." "Victoria, please," Evelyn sobbed, the reality of losing her country club status, her luxury SUV, and her mansion all in the span of an hour, finally breaking her psyche. "Where are we supposed to go?" "I don't know," I said softly, looking out at the snow-capped Alps. "But you're not going anywhere on my dime ever again." I placed the receiver back on the cradle. The heavy click echoed in the quiet hotel suite. The leverage was gone. The trap was broken. For the first time in 30 years, the air in my lungs felt entirely my own. 6 months later, the Connecticut estate was sold to a commercial developer for a massive premium, and the liquidated funds were quietly wired directly into my offshore encrypted account. Without my platinum credit cards and premium health insurance to float their manufactured lifestyle, my parents were forced to quietly downsize into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a zip code they used to actively make fun of at dinner parties. Arthur had to take a job as a mid-level manager at a logistics firm, reporting to a boss 20 years his junior. They tried to spin a tragic, fabricated narrative to our extended family, claiming that the stress of the corporate buyout had caused me to suffer a mental breakdown and abandon them. Their story worked perfectly, generating waves of sympathy from my aunts and uncles, right up until the afternoon I sent a single photograph to the massive family group chat. It was a high-resolution picture of my shredded, mutilated American passport sitting on my penthouse hardwood floor, placed right next to a screenshot of the declined $800 L'Auberge restaurant receipt with the exact timestamp of their lunch. I didn't add any text to the message. I just hit send and watched the read receipts tick by. The family group chat went completely, permanently dead. Neither of my parents has spoken to a relative since, too humiliated by the forensic proof of their own extortion to ever show their faces at a holiday dinner again. Meanwhile, I expanded my new consulting firm across Geneva and Paris, completely debt-free, with a brand new biometric passport and absolutely zero dead weight holding me down. If your own parents committed a federal felony to trap you in the country and steal your multi-million-dollar company, would you have warned them about your backup plan? Or would you have let them find out the hard way while their credit cards declined in front of a crowded luxury restaurant like I did? Let me know exactly how you would handle this betrayal in the comments below. If you loved this story of absolute cold surgical justice, drop a like, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video.